So I've referenced the Prague Houppelande quite a bit by this point, and even gone into depth a little bit in some of the other discussions around what a Houppelande is and how I believe they're constructed. But I'd like to spend just a little bit of time going a bit deeper into the garment that we call the Prague Houppelande. The garment itself it was constructed specifically in 1396, in February of 1396 to be quite exact, because that is when Jan Zorlecki, or John of Gorlitz, John Duke of Gorlitz, passed unexpectedly. And he passed in Germany in a area called Lusatia, and that is a historic part of Germany, not too far actually from Gorlitz, which is also in current Germany now. When he died, he was transported back to Prague. Jan Zorlecki was the son of Charles IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the half-brother of King Wenceslas of Bohemia. And when he passed, he was brought back to be buried in Prague, and because that was where the head of, or the capital, or the central part of Bohemia was at that point. So the trip from Lusatia to Prague, it's about 180 kilometers. And back in the day, a horse-drawn cart, which would be transporting the body, could do, on average, the estimation is 10 to 30 miles a day. Let's go in the middle, say 20. So that trip from Lusatia to Prague could take anywhere from 5 to 9 days. Regardless, rigor mortis has set in at that point. And that is actually important to keep in mind as we discuss this garment. So that's a little bit of context on who this garment was made for. The cool thing is that when this garment was recovered from the royal crypt in St. Wenceslas Cathedral, no, St. Vitus Cathedral, I'm so sorry, St. Vitus Cathedral, and in the royal crypt. And when they were exhumed, his body was there, and we know exactly how tall he was. And we have contemporary records that discuss his build, and he was described as slight. So we know how tall he was and how his build was, which the reason that that's awesome is we also have the measurements of his burial Houppelande, and this allows us to understand exactly how this garment fit on him. So the garment itself was constructed pretty fast. You know, what they suspect had happened is that the Duke passed, and I believe it was February 21st, actually, of 1396. And they think they sent a rider out to Prague to let them know what had happened. And a horse and rider can travel much faster than a horse and cart. And so what they suspected is there was probably about 4 to 5 day lead time to get a garment constructed, maybe a little bit longer, could say 7 days. But regardless, they didn't have a ton of time to get this garment constructed, which makes it all the more impressive considering how many seams that had to have been sewn. Which transitions into how is the garment constructed. And I've spent a lot of time already talking about how I believe houppelans are constructed. This one is constructed of 19 trapezoids, 19 gores, with the narrow points of all the gores meeting at the shoulder, with the flat points of those at the tops of the trapezoids that creates the shoulder. And it creates an A-line garment that has 10 gores in the back and then 9 gores in the front. And the original fabric that it was constructed out of was silk velvet. It looks brown now, but chemical analysis, spectral analysis that was done, it was actually black. It was the arms are abnormally long, and there's been a lot of supposition on why those arms, the length of the arms would be like so abnormally wrong. And there's been some speculation, was it because they were trying to cover the hands because rigor mortis had set in, and that could be the case. There's a lot of different speculation, because when you look at the garment, like, these sleeves are abnormally long. I tend to think it's a little bit more prosaic, and that we see in the written record around this time period that incredibly long sleeves that extended far past the hand were quite fashionable at this time, and they would often cuff them or roll them back. So for me, I tend to think that this is more just, it was done in the fashion, as this entire houppelande was built in the fashion of houppelans of the day. And I've talked a lot about that in prior discussions. So I went to Prague multiple times to study this garment, but one specific time I actually met with Dr. Milena Bravermanova, who was formerly the head textile conservator for the museum at Prague Castle, where this garment and actually many other garments exist. And I was able to meet with her and have some discussions with her around this garment. She also published an article in 2006 about the houppelande in a Czech publication called Archeologica Historica, or Historica Archeologica. And it was volume 31 of the 2006 publication. And within it, she talks a lot about the warp and the weft of the fabric. And this is where she talks about how tall he was, and the build of Jean Zorlecki. It goes into detail a little bit further around the preservation, and you can find a translation that I paid to have translated from a Xeroxed copy that she sent me on my website, medievalburgundy.com. I think it is well worth the read. It's not terribly long, and the original Czech article is there as well. So why have I paid so much attention to the Prague Houppelande as opposed to some of the other garments that I've talked about? Especially, why did I consult this one so heavily in creating my 12th night Houppelande that is based off of a miniature of the wedding of Charles VI of France. And the reason is this. Despite the fact that there are shortcuts that have been taken with this houppelande, because they were trying to get it ready for a burial, and it didn't have to necessarily be the best constructed, it just needed to look okay, and be appropriate to the station of the person who they were making it for, in this case, a duke. It is, however, representative of the popular styles at the time, and we know this from the written record, as I've also talked about. And through my conversations with Dr. Bravermanova, she is very convinced that this was made in the style of what was contemporary, because the Duke was not royal and therefore was not entitled to the traditional royal cope that members of the royal family would have been buried in. So he would have been buried in something fashionable, as was the case for this period in history. So we know that, while it being unlined is probably more of a case of the rush to get this finished, and the incredibly chunky stitches. I mean, there aren't very many original stitches left on the garment, but based off of my analysis, the few that are left, which are on the collar, it's about 4 to 5 stitches per inch, which is not super small. Those are big old chunky stitches. But those pieces aside, the garment itself, it shows us a lot about how it was how houppelans were constructed, especially when you cross-reference it with other extant garments like Hrolfn's Fine's garment 63, and then multiple items in the written record, that are contemporary, and then both preceding and succeeding this garment that talk about how these were constructed. Of course, the design of the Prague Houppelande is representative of how houppelans would have fit on a person. The other thing that I think is very interesting, and in discussing with Dr. Bravermanova around how it was cut, the idea, with gores, is that, if you do it, like you lay out gores, like this on a piece of fabric, you can actually get a lot of volume, without using nearly as much of fabric. And so, the idea is that the houppelande was cut, in gores, from one length of black silk velvet, and the gores themselves, we have the fabric analysis, the warp and the weft, which I think is super interesting, not necessarily applicable for this, but it does show how the gores were placed in terms of their nap, and how they handled that. And so I've built some very basic graphics that kind of show how it would have been laid out, and what the assembly, how it would have been assembled. Taking into account the nap. So the other interesting thing about the Prague Houppelande is that the collar is a band. It's just a banded collar, and a lot of times you see these giant standing collars, and it's often supposed that the collars are cut into the actual body of the garment. But in this case, and in the case of garment 63, they both have band collars. And I found that fascinating because it's not necessarily as commonly accepted as, there were just simple band collars applied to the gores, but it makes complete sense when you think about it. And so what I love about it is you can still see the way they folded the fabric over itself and created a sort of a felled seam in this collar, which had multiple layers as they applied it to a single layer of the body. And it's actually one of the clearest pieces of the Houppelande that you can see in the preservation notes. And I think that's fascinating, and that also informed how I decided to attach my collar as well. So there's a lot that this garment did to influence the measurements and how I scaled my Houppelande. Less so the number of gores, but more so the actual volume of the garment to make sure that it fit me the way this garment fit the Duke of Gorlitz. So I hope that is a bit informational, takes you through a little bit more about the Prague Houppelande. And if you're interested in like what I have from my visit there, photos from the preservation notes, and all of that, you're welcome to them either on my Pinterest page. And on my Facebook, actually. I think I have an album for them on my Facebook. So for friends on Facebook, you can also find them there too. So that's the Prague Houppelande. And next one, let's talk about how I actually built my Houppelande and how it was inspired.